to start rather. This is the, you're in the right place for the lecture by Lead Pencil Studio with T-Space. And I will just take a couple of moments for introductions while our audience joins us. So welcome to T-Space Architecture Lecture Series. And thank you for joining us today for the lecture called Ephemeral States by Lead Pencil Studio. This is the 8th in a series of 8 public lectures, so it's our last one within the framework of the Architecture Residency program, which is in its 3rd week now, with literally a couple more days to go. Final presentations are already coming up on Monday next week. I am Irene Zachreli, I'm a practicing architect and an educator in New York, currently instructing and directing the Architecture Residency program for T-Space. Very quickly, for those of you who are new, T-Space is a nonprofit organization. It is an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation. It focuses on arts, education, design, and ecology. T-Space introduced the Architecture Residency program 5 years ago. It takes place once a year. It's a 25-day intensive every July, and it urges the residents to design and think critically. This year's theme is a continuation of last year's transformation of consciousness. I am especially grateful that our residents are able to get partial or full scholarships. Our scholarship program is growing every year. This year, we were very thankful to have the support by Steve Pullman, Tillman Engineers, the Al Held Foundation, and the Art of Building in Rhinebeck, among other supporters. We would certainly welcome your support as well to make more scholarships available in the future and to help T-Space carry out its mission in education. And if you would like to do so, we very much welcome you to make a contribution now by clicking the link in the chat. We would be very, very grateful for your support. In addition to the residency program that I just introduced, T-Space organizes what we call the Synthesis of the Arts events at the intersection of art, architecture, music, and poetry. Our first Synthesis of the Arts event, called Raptures and Reconciliations, is now on show at T-Space Gallery. You can visit that actually in person. You can schedule for an appointment by clicking the link that you see in the chat. Our second synthesis of event for 2021 is coming up by the end of August, and it is called Suspended Collapse, which does feature work by Lead Pencil Studio, who we have here with us today. And we're very, very pleased to hear from you ahead of your show. And poetry by Lisa Robertson and music by Lester St. Louis. So you can certainly register for that event by clicking into the chat, the link that you can see, and RSVP for their upcoming show. I would like to encourage you also to join our mailing list at T-Space so you can receive announcements firsthand. And you may also like to consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, where all the recordings of our events and our lectures are uploaded. So you have access to this incredible resource for free. You can, I think this is from my end from announcements. I would like to introduce Maxwell Fang, who is also an architect. Hello, Max. He's the administrator for the residency program. He's been a great help, and he will be leading the Q&A session, which will follow after the presentation. And with us is also Reggie Mays, who's one of our residents, and he will be introducing Anihan and Dan Mahalo. If I mispronounce it, please correct me, Dan. And Reggie will also introduce his fellow residents. I'll pass it on to Reggie now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As my name is Reggie Mace, and I'm also joined by Megan Pisarczyk, Yolanda Wen, Alexander Kern, Jack Wethu, and Brian Hartman. And today we have Lead Pencil Studio, an architecture collaborative founded in 1997 by Annie Han and Daniel Mahalio in Seattle, Washington. They describe their work as architecture in reverse. Our projects are everything about architecture with none of its function. Spaces with no greater purpose than to be perceived and question the certainty posited by the made world. Their projects can reframe the invisible as a question to society. The mundane architectural conditions we see every day shifted into the limelight. Casting moonlight from fictional windows, visual static framing a roadside billboard that isn't there, restoring landscape inside the building which displaced it, and monumentalizing hypothetical urban ruins are examples of their modus operandi. Seattle's The Stranger says they subordinate art and emphasize the total sum of human activity, which is social. Awarded the Founders Rome Prize by the American Academy in Rome and recognized as one of the emerging voices by the Architectural League of New York are just two of the recognition and award. I was fortunate enough to visit a few of their exhibitions, Minus Space at Henry Art and Mary Hill Double at Mary Hill Museum in 2005 and 6 while I was still pursuing my Bachelor in Fine Arts degree, and thereafter at Frye Gallery in 2015. It is my honor today to introduce Lead Pencil Studio.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you all. I hope you can hear us okay. We've got this little microphone set up in the middle here. Let's see. Yeah, it's we've done some virtual events this year. It's nice to see you and not see a bunch of you too, but hopefully you can hear us well, and hopefully we can have some nice conversation toward the end too. You know, we titled our lecture as Ephemeral State. I think it just kind of a nice phrase that combines all of our efforts that we've been working on, and sort of a fleeting thoughts to the moments that you capture in your phones and photographs. To, you know, years and years ago, when we were using regular black and white photography and cameras, if you guys are old enough to remember those things, you actually had to show up at a site and sit and wait until the sunlight was right to capture those moments, and, you know, to capture a perfect moment. So a lot of it's changed, but I think our feelings about the space and what we want to explore has kind of remained the same, which is to think about architecture without any of its functions attached, and then what are you left with? And so today's lecture, I think we'll concentrate on a few, instead of showing, you know, a bunch of projects, a few projects, and kind of go into a story a little more in depth. And then we'll finish with at the end with the kind of couple of most recent projects that are very different from one another. So I'll go ahead and start the share screen. Dan, do you have anything to add before I?
Yeah, I think we can just get started. We selected a bunch of work, some of which goes back a long time, including Mary Hill Double, I think is one that we felt like related well to the project that you guys are working on for your farm project in upstate New York and the pavilion. And we wanted to give you just a teeny bit of context on how we got involved in the art making practice. Annie and I both went to the school at the University of Oregon, which is kind of a combined program with a fine art program and the architecture bachelor program in the same building. And you're encouraged to take all your electives in both disciplines. So we had a lot of art students in the architecture program, and certainly Annie and I took all of our electives in the art program. So while we were at school in Oregon, we were doing a lot of traveling around the state. And this is in the early 90s when there was a big controversy going on regarding spotted owl preservation in the state. And there was a big effort to both preserve the jobs in the timber industry and also preserve habitat, which had to be old growth forests for this dwindling population of a rare and very tiny bird. And when we were out photographing, we started seeing really hundreds of sawmills closing around the state. And so we started a photographic documentary project on sawmill architecture in the Pacific Northwest. And we got a grant from the Graham Foundation and from our school to document these structures. And we ended up producing a book called Woodburners in 1997, which was a didactic kind of historical book about the history of these unique structures, which are these conical shaped steel buildings that are designed to burn the wood waste that comes out of sawmills. So about 70% of every log is lumber, 30% gets turned into sawdust, and they had to burn it by mandate from the insurance companies. So these are these enormous structures. They would vary from 50 to 120 feet tall. And some of them had these louvers at the top, and they would heat up and shrink based on the heat from the fire inside. And so you would get these fissures on the interior. And this is actually how we met Stephen Hall. He came to Seattle to lecture, and he was doing a project in, I think it was Port Ludlow, on a site of a sawmill that had closed. And he was doing a chapel on the grounds where one of these woodburners were. And after the lecture, we sent him a bunch of photographs that we had been taking, documenting these structures. And he wrote back and he's like, "Hey, these are fantastic. You guys should do a pamphlet with Princeton Architectural Press." So he made the introduction, and that's eventually how that book got published. So our history with him goes back till 1997, and we've stayed in touch and friends over the years. So that's how we got started doing black and white documentary photography. These are all large format pictures. And then that turned into a second study on concrete foundations that are left over from buildings that were built in the American West.
I just wanted to point out this photograph and the last photograph. As you can see, the last photograph is from exterior, and it was like really the first time when we were documenting, we got to go inside and see the space, because usually it's a utilitarian, tool that people don't go in there and look at the interior. I think it changed profoundly how we look at the space and what we thought about architecture. And I think our approaches of enclosure and space have really shaped our practice since this project. I just wanted to point that out quickly.
Yeah, I think that is a good point, because let's just go back, because I think that's a really nice thing that I haven't heard you say before. This thing, which is such a solid and appeared at every sawmill site in different forms, but really the only people who would have been inside were maintenance guys who would go in there and clean out debris, ash, or fix the fans that were at the base. But so this was a privileged interior view that only came available as the sawmills were closing. And then when we found out that the interiors had these incredible spaces, I think really it did change us at how we perceive this idea of solid and void. So the next project that we got right after that was a residency at with the Center for Land Use Interpretation, which is a really great residency that's hosted out of Los Angeles, and they have several sites around the American West. The one that we were after was this one in Wendover, Nevada. Annie, can you point out on the map? It's like right here.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Can you guys see that cursor? Okay.
Right there.
Yeah. Okay. So that's it's 2 hours west of Salt Lake City, and it's in this. It's where you always see those car commercials. Cruising around salt flats with miles and miles of nothingness. They set you up in this little gambling town, which is the closest place you can gamble if you're a Salt Lake City citizen, and it's also the site of a World War II air base, which is where they actually assembled the atomic bombs that were flown to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's a really loaded site. This is a picture of those B-12 bombers, like looking down at the airfield at Wendover. And this airfield is still there. Most of the buildings are there, but dilapidated because the air base has been defunct for a long time. There's the state line running down the middle. So Utah on one side and Nevada on the other. These are some of the buildings that the Center for Land Use Interpretation rents. The one that we were in is like right here. And here's the airplane hangar where the Enola Gay was actually housed. They set you up in like a construction trailer, and there's a little studio, a map room, and also a shop. So it's a really interesting place to have a 1 month residency in the desert, and you're completely alone for the month that you're there. There's kind of view out the window with the hangar out to your right, and the wood shop. And these are some of the ammunition bunkers that are kind of littered around the desert and the area, and some of the irrigation ditches for a big chlorine plant that are nearby. So we were there for a month in 2002 and started photographing basically the detritus of the industrial and resource extraction industries that were in that area. And I think we wanted to share, we haven't shown these pictures for a while, but we wanted to share them with you because it sort of began our interest in what are the human remains from Western occupation of the landscape, and what are the spaces that are developed as a result of them or in anticipation of them, because there's a lot of projects that were also started but not finished, or you might catch them like kind of mid-construction. But these are this sort of residue we found interesting because it operates at the periphery of your vision, and it's a lot of people describe it as flyover country, but when you're passing through it or living in it, there are these lines which are developed everywhere, crossing the landscape, whether it's a railroad track, a fence, power line, or the horizon. And those kind of peripheral lines of demarcation we started to find really interesting in relationship to concrete foundations. So these are some that are just in and around that airbase when we were documenting, thinking a lot about what is suggested by concrete work that's left in the ground and what could come later as a result of human sort of scratching at the land and trying to make utilitarian use of it.
I think also the landscape itself was such a stark different environment for us coming from Northwest. And that was really interesting to us. The point of reference was so vastly different. There were no sort of a verticality to the landscape, and it was just so horizontal, and it was hard to kind of navigate or kind of predict the scale between, or the distance between yourself and any point. And so that was really interesting discovery, or just kind of exploring how do you navigate your relationship to landscape when you can't really decipher the distance between you and any sort of object and in your field of view. And so these piles of debris and the remains of building components became a very important sort of a point of reference for us, along with the kind of a visual interest that it provided for us to view, kind of document. And I think also the possibilities in neglected, discarded, abandoned became a very interesting subject for us to study and think about. And how do we relate to a space or a structure when we discover them that were not part of your design or any sort of a program that you were familiar with. These are some photographs that we documented and were printed for museum shows at that time.
I think what we started to take away, and I think one reason why we wanted to share these with you today was that it's not always the act of building like a container that space is within, but sometimes it's just a matter of describing an edge. And fences and lines are so legible to our vocabulary. They speak to us and our relationship to them, I think, because of our building practice and our building history. And so they're incredibly effective at generating place and demarcating space with the most minimal gesture. Kind of thinking a little bit like Fred Sandbeck and his use of strings and lines in gallery spaces. These sort of operate at the landscape level. All it would take would be to draw, to place a series of fence posts and then to link them, and you get these really powerful demarcations of space, which which start to influence human behavior. You can imagine if you came to this site, how could you not walk through that, the vestige of that doorway? You'd be drawn to it. It would control your movement through this landscape, where if none of it was here, you might not pass this one location. So I think that started to really influence us and how we wanted to start working in the Western landscape and start thinking about space and how it changes in perpetuity when you place an object out there. As part of that residency, we began to do a series of drawings. These are just analog pencil on mylar drawings that were done by hand while we were out at Windover and during that residency. When you were there, you do a residency and then you can come back like a year later and then hold an exhibition, of which almost nobody will come and see it, except for German tourists who are really into land art. And so there were a lot of people who came out to see it from Germany, but that was about it.
I was just going to say, these drawings and smaller sculptures, we were sort of switching the roles of heavy versus light, and which carries which, and what are the implications of that, and is it a kind of a exercise in failure or like putting moments in danger? So it was kind of a fun to kind of think about it in terms that the previous drawing showed a really heavy column being suspended in the whole. Sitting on the timber structures on the side.
And this is an ink on paper drawing. Basically, it's an imaginary landscape of railroad piers that are crossing a fictional body of water. It's sort of the pre-construction or post-construction. Again,
kind of switching the role of foundation as solid to void by just kind of rendering all the foundation location as a complete void, as a kind of a visual sort of study of, what conjured up sort of other ideas looking at those. This was sort of an imagined landscape of a city after all the building has been, left. And if you were to dug up all the things that are below ground that were carrying the buildings, all the foundations and components of foundation, if they were to surface up, what their landscape may look like.
Okay, we're gonna, now we'll just talk, we wanted to talk a little bit more about Mary Hill Double because I think it is such a great example of all of the things that we really wanted to work on related to Western landscape and the Western notion of occupation of the land. So this was the project, just to give you a little visual ahead of time, if you hadn't seen an image of it before. It was called Mary Hill Double, and it's a duplication in full volume of a museum that's about 1.5 miles away across the Columbia River Gorge. This view is just looking west down the river. We'll show you some more in a second. The site of it there is right in the middle of the screen, near Biggs Junction, which is a nothing gas station town. Goldendale is the nearest small town. There's Hood River, which is famous for windsurfing, and then Portland. So it's 2 hours upriver or 5 hours from Seattle. And it's on the site of the Mary Hill Art Museum, which is in this incredibly arid landscape, cold in the winter and gets to like 115 in the summer. Sam Hill on the left here was the creator of the original museum. He was an important industrialist and a very eccentric person in the West Coast. He had in mind a Quaker city. So he built like 10 Quaker houses and a meeting house and a post office and a bank, and went back to Pennsylvania to get Quakers to move out and start farming, but nobody took him up on the offer. This was his mansion that he started building, but it was never finished during his lifetime. And after he passed away, 3 of his female friends got together and created a museum under his name.
I wanted to insert something. This image is really interesting to me. It's both like intriguing and really scary for me, because it's a single guy going out to this unknown landscape and decide to build a first concrete building, I think, in the state. And that gesture, I think anybody who's done work that is kind of a beyond anything that you've done in the past, it's kind of a next step forward. You know how scary and risk-taking that is. And so when I look at this photograph, I think about that, like how strange and how lonely and how scary it must be to be the first person in this landscape. Nobody else is around there at the time. And it's both inspiring and kind of scary looking at this photograph.
Its ultimate failure was that the water was, 1,500 feet below this building. So they had no way to irrigate and get the water up there. So it was a kind of a monumental act of hubris to like not consider that aspect of it. But it did eventually become this museum, which has got the largest Rodin collection outside of Paris, because this guy collected Rodin really early. Anyway, it's a pretty interesting place to visit if you ever go there. And it's I think modeled after the Palace of Marie Antoinette. It's a very classical building. The interior is very formal. This would have been the living room. And he wanted to be able to drive his car into the living room. So he created those giant ramps that are on the side of it.
And I think that photograph also is interesting to me too, because when we were driving through this landscape, we would always see the building from exterior, and it looks so monumental in that landscape because there isn't anything of that scale in that area, for those of you who've been there. And so I've always imagined before I went into the museum that inside would have this very monumental singular space in there, but it was built as a residence, so the spaces looked like that, a very kind of domestic scale, and it was sort of a letdown when I first walked in there. And so I think our idea sort of developed, like, what if we were to give Maryhill Museum the volume that it should had, or in our minds, and so that's how the idea developed for the Maryhill Double project.
So it's basically a spatial duplicate, or a self-portrait. It's perpendicular across the river. I think I mentioned about 1.5 miles away. So it's just a dot on the landscape, but you can kind of see it here in the aerial view. To get there, it's about a 15-mile drive the long way. The site itself that we leased is owned by 3 ranching families in Alaska. They have 5,000 acres, and it took almost a year to negotiate the lease. And we got a grant from the Creative Capital Foundation, and it was the first really big project that we had ever done. So it was for us, it was way out of scale for what we were prepared for, but we learned a lot in the process. And it was one of these sites that was treacherous for us. There was a lot of things to worry about in terms of having visitors come there. This is us trying to figure out like how to get the public to the site. Right behind my head there, you can see the museum in the background is a little white dot. So we had a lot of wildfire issues. This place always burns every year. So we had to worry about like if it did burn, like how would it affect what was going on there in terms of access. We had to hire a surveyor to help us identify what was due south exactly, so we could be perfectly aligned with the museum. We couldn't do it. Every time we thought we had it right, it kept changing with light. And so we ended up having to really nail it down with the surveyor. So here we are kind of figuring out what the 4 corners would be. And then we had the scaffolding donated by Waco Scaffolding in Portland. They drove out with their trucks, and then they helped us set up the initial frame. And then Annie and I spent the next few weeks basically doing all the cladding and finishing of it.
There were a lot of interested volunteers, and not knowing the conditions of the site, we didn't want to put people in a harmful conditions. So it was 2 of us who were out there for, I can't remember, like 3 weeks or so. And there were a lot of, wild things. This was a time in year that flying red ants mated, and they would find the highest point in any field of their view. And it used to be, some trees there. And then once we showed up, with the scaffolding, it was the scaffolding that was the highest point, and then we got on top of scaffolding, and then we were the highest point. So they were having an orgy while they were working, like in clusters. They were mating. So I think because of that reason, none of us, we didn't get bites from these flying ants. And then this is a black widow. We were just joking around, like, I wonder if there's a black widow there. And then the camera station that we made to document continuously, one day we opened, and there she was waiting for our hands. And there were rattlesnakes there. And so we had to, and then there's this, we've never seen it before or after. It kind of looks like something between mosquito and dragonfly. And it is as big as sort of a dragonfly. And we saw it in action, like catch a wasp and tear its head off and ate it right in front of us, to kind of show like, hey, you're in our territory or something. So there are a lot of wild things there. This is another day we were working, and I think it was like over, it was 3,000 lightning strikes that one night, or
30,000.
30,000. So it was like a, it was like a fireworks, you know. And so at some point, and I'm like, well, maybe we should get down from the scaffolding, Dan. And so he was like, one more picture and then I get down. So he happened to capture this photograph. It was amazing. The wildfires that Dan talked about was very near us. So there were things that were happening around us constantly. And the wind, I'm sure some of you know, is known, that area is known as the wind capital of the world. I think they do windsurfing. And so it would affect our structure there. It would rip up. And so we'd have to do some repairs between weekends. You can see between the chimneys there at Maryhill Museum, light blue structure there is a double, and is set on the platform. So when people drove by, it kind of looked like a billboard structure from afar. We had a little welcome hut. We sat there to welcome people and offer some water. And you were able to then drive to a certain point and had to take about a quarter mile, walk to the site, and you were able to ascend the structure and kind of look at take in the view of the landscape around you. I think this project was a really sort of a meaningful project for me because it kind of got back at the fundamentals of what I think of architecture and spaces, that it is simply carving out an air, a nothing, and then containing with the material as minimum as you can make. And then all of a sudden that void becomes something that is occupiable. And for that reason, it was really important for us to find the fabric that matched the sky, the color of the sky in the area. We ended up sourcing it out from actually Germany and had to bring it all the way back.
There's some things I think that we also were thinking about a lot, which is that it's just a history of like European Western occupation is really important to us. In this particular image, this is actually a wagon rut of the Oregon Trail that we found out ran through the site. It's still there 150 years later. And this is a trail that we think is from the cattle, but it's been there for also hundreds of years. We thought that the act of people walking around the piece in a square or rectangle, there was a path that was developed because there were so many people walking around it and then going up the staircase and down, that path would remain. But we recently revisited and it's not there. And so it's kind of amazing that some parts of the land, completely did restore themselves. We thought a lot about like what would be left after this project and how would this action have some impact on the land. But more importantly, like what is that act of making architecture or a gesture, and how does that change the land forever? I think that the museum across the gorge is really one of those objects. It's because it's such a desolate landscape. It's just one of those things that humans now gravitate towards. It's a tourist destination. Wineries have built up around it. Now the museum has put up a bunch of a solar generating plant and also a wind farm. So it's like now become a locus by which more human activity is developing. And I think that that's really interesting and something that's really important to think about as architects and artists. Like all that we do has an impact on the landscape for the millennium. And so I think it's thinking about that and about what those gestures are and how permanent they are and what's left afterwards, vis-a-vis the foundations that are left behind after our occupation of the land and what could become later. So when we were done with the project, the same 2 trucks came out and we loaded them up, and then we donated that blue mesh which is a scaffolding debris netting back to the scaffold company, and they just put it back into the construction stream. And I'm sure eventually it found its way to the landfill, but it had a few more uses before we were done with it. And this is that view today of the landscape looking down on it, and you can kind of still see the Oregon Trail, Wagon Rut, and then the cattle pathway through it. Okay. Okay, so we wanted to share a little bit about some of the independent research that we've been doing with laser scanning and LiDAR work. We might be the first artists to ever get a hold of this. Early on, I had seen use of it at the Seattle Department of Transportation when they were trying to figure out where it was likely in Seattle that there would be new landslides because it's on steep topography. And so this was an early hillshade study with aerial LiDAR looking at Seattle. And when I saw this, I think in 2002, I was just stunned by this human scraping of the land, like terraforming things, creating flat building sites, carving out land for roads. And so when we started to research what tool created this image, we found out that it was made by Leica, which is a camera company that had bought the rights to this early technology. It was originally created to map pipes in petroleum refineries because they're such complicated 3D matrices. And so we got early access to it during the Rome Prize to learn how to use the very first version of that machine created by Cyrax. You can see here, super heavy, had to have giant batteries that came with it. This is our studio in Rome. And this was our very first scan when we were there after we finally got permission. That machine originally cost, I think, $500,000. So it just wasn't in the realm of artists to be able to get a hold of. And this is, I guess now, it was like 14 years ago. So the technology has come a long way. I'm sure you guys have seen examples of it, but these were our very first test studies when we were trying to figure out, well, what does this machine do and where are its mistakes? And this image was important to us because it taught us that it was shooting a photograph and laying the color data on top of these millions of points measurements, but sometimes, well, always actually, they would misregister the two. So you would get these weird sort of like double exposures happening between color and data. So we started to like mess around with some of the mistakes that this supposedly super accurate machine made. And we were taking the machine down into Rome and looking at the spaces between buildings, but then we started to see all kinds of things that we had never seen before, almost like you'd picked up a camera for your first time. Like there were lots of just spatial things that we didn't notice, like windows that aligned from across the street that just happened to perfectly align. And what if we took out like all of the materials of the building and just left the windows? Like what would that spatial arrangement look like? So it was a process of capturing and then subtraction and then manipulating this data.
This this image just shows that kind of a more darkened window is the exact alignment with the building across the street that aligns with this building. And for us, it was really remarkable because it was built during different times. And what was also interesting is, as many of you know, that Rome is built with the stone. Most of the buildings were, and when we did this scan, they just seemed so light. It was completely opposite of what the reality of the built environment was. So that was really interesting to us to be able to, formulate or come up with some other way of describing this really heavy buildings, stone buildings.
This is us beginning to manually draw on top of LiDAR scans. In 2011, we got another grant with the Van Allen Institute to work on an extension of that project in New York. So we spent 3 months as residents with the Van Allen Institute and basically took big pieces of lower Manhattan. All the spaces here in red are the areas that we scanned. And it was basically just information gathering, trying to figure out what makes New York spatially so unique and such a destination and different in texture and materials and space than, say, Rome. And so most of the time was spent just data gathering. By now we knew how to use the machine really well. There were newer versions, and we were just moving across the city really rapidly, mostly working in the afternoon and the nighttime when there was just less traffic, and just capturing as much of Manhattan as we could. Again, process of extraction of data and subtraction, and then modeling some of this material just to study what are these vertiginous spaces like that exist in parts of Lower Manhattan that were built on like wagons and cart-sized roads, but then the city zoning had bumped up so much, especially in the Wall Street area, that you get these 50-story buildings, but like 16 feet wide streets. Everything else that was scanned, of course, we captured, and then it became interesting for us to start to model some of those shapes that were out there and turn them into solids.
This is an installation that we did at Van Allen Institute at their storefront space, and we wanted to kind of capture the cavity between the buildings. So it's right behind the building, looking down at the kind of a air shaft, and there were just hundreds of air conditioned units, which is something that we don't see in the West Coast. And so this beautiful kind of usable space was abandoned with the, for the air conditioners to occupy. And so we wanted to kind of bring that information to the front of the building. It's an area that people don't get to have access to, or visibility access to also.
This is a spray paint mural, basically right on top of their storefront facade, which became their bookstore. This is another piece on Cortland Alley. It was a particularly nice alley just because it's got that sense of palimpsest of like hundreds of years of people coming across the same space and making and remaking it. And we just love, it's about 3 blocks long, and we scanned, I don't know, a couple dozen scans and stitched them all together to capture all this incredible parasitic stuff that's hanging off of buildings in that area. It was interesting to us, I think, just because of its texture, but also just thinking about, okay, what is that surface that gets made by people remaking things over and over, and when they start to fall apart and get fixed and remade again, and what does that start to look like? And if you stripped away all of the color and material data and just looked at form, what are those forms? And so it was an open-ended research for us that resulted in some surprising discoveries that became a lot of different art projects over the years. So it was useful. But I wanted to show this picture because last week there was an article in the paper about this PPOW gallery that was saying how, oh, it's the rebirth of Lower Manhattan and how galleries are moving in there. This is the same space of that wall. You can kind of see that little filigree pattern below the window. Is that same one right there. So it got remade again in the last 10 years. So it's really fun to see it being reborn all over again in the same building. A scan from the
under the bridge.
Yeah, Lower Manhattan Bridge. Shadows from things on buildings. These steam vents in Manhattan, we realized that we could actually scan steam. So we started to look for those opportunities and see what are the spatial qualities of those steam clouds that come out of those maintenance.
While doing the scans in New York, we just realized that you don't really get to experience the architecture so much, but the things that are attached to architecture in a city like New York. And so if you kind of look at that circled area, as your 60-degree cone of vision, majority of the portion of that, what you see is, if you were to take away the sky and residual areas, is really limited amount of information of the building that you're seeing. And of that, if you take away actually the signs and ducts and all those things that away from your visual field, then really what you're left is about 33% of the image that you're seeing becomes part of architecture, as we know, and that we design, that you actually get to see. And 40% of the other things were really making up the cities. That is your encounter with the city. And so that became a focus of our kind of art making and installation for museum shows. And while we were capturing the void space or neglected space, it was really the surface that we had to capture in order for us to view those things. So we ended up making this sculpture installation called the Surface Deposit from our scan work. And we kind of utilized that kind of a double exposure aspect by painting colors just offset from the sculpture itself.
This was a show, an installation at the Temple Art Gallery in Philadelphia of a corner store in Philadelphia based on a scan, including the boss's office. And then we began to do more work related to just that palimpsest of history, and another installation at Mass Art in Boston, made of plywood, of all of that material that gets attached to architecture that begins to describe the city. You might need to click on the.
Oh, okay.
I think we want to end on this one, Annie, because of the timing.
Yeah, I mean, we'll just show two projects that we did recently that are so different. This is kind of in the middle of a development housing, and they called us to design a treehouse. I think it's an idea that architects came up with, and they wanted to have a treehouse. And we said, well, you have no trees for us to make a treehouse. So we came up with this idea of island treehouse, which was kind of a convenient excuse for us to kind of explore the section of an island as a landscape, and then making an occupiable space inside of that as a kind of a different iteration of treehouse. So this was our proposal drawing in the middle of the apartment courtyard. The single concrete column was given, so it had to kind of sit on that single column. And then the next image is the framework was made off-site because the building was being built so rapidly. And so the idea was to make the frame, and then we would crane in the structure in the center of the court. This is the finished project, and they really just wanted to have some area they could have a barbecue and be open. And we just thought, in Seattle, as of last year, it rained 9 months out of the year. So we wanted to make sure that it was area that people can utilize around the entire year. This is kind of going across the bridge into the treehouse. And this is pretty different than the other sculptural work that we do. So we just wanted to show a small project that we had done. And then next. Yeah,
this last one is in Lubbock, Texas. We just finished this last year. I don't know if anybody has ever been to Lubbock, but it's kind of the center for cotton growing in Texas. It's in a very arid area. The town really didn't get its start until around 1926, when it was established to be an agricultural college for Texas Tech University. So they decided right from the start that everything would be Spanish Renaissance is going to be the prevailing architecture for the campus. So everything on that campus is built in that style since then. The early buildings were quite nice, and the later ones, of course, are very postmodern. But we wanted to create a project that sort of like riffed on that idea of a translation of a translation. So this project is called Oblique Intersection. And it borrows a lot of campus architectural iconography and compiles it into a single piece. And then the entire geometry is oblique in plan. So it's not that noticeable actually from photographs. You have to kind of move around to see it, but it was incredibly difficult to build. We built it in 6 pieces in our shop in Seattle, upside down, because, well, it's too complicated to explain, but we had to stitch all the pieces together. So we had to have flat surfaces to build against, almost like pouring concrete. And then we welded the filigree internally inside of the formwork. So it, and then went down there for a few weeks and then welded them all the parts together. It's about 4 feet wide, 30 feet tall, and 50 feet long. And then it has all these different kinds of translucency. It was the first time we revisited this type of making and this scale since the piece that we did at the border station, non-sign. So it was really nice for us to revisit it, but what we wanted to explore was working translucently within this filigree cloud material. So there's lots of things going on. There's a seat interior, there's a stair, part of which can be ascended, and then all these layers of windows that are exterior on the surface and interior. And, you know, we knew that this is on a college environment that students would try to climb it. So it had to be something that was robust enough that we just knew that we're going to be crawling through those windows and that type of thing. And the campus was very forward in supporting this project. And it was really, really nice to be able to build. You can kind of see some of that obliqueness happening on the right-hand side where it just looks like a sharp edge. It's actually not 90 degrees, but everything is at a 60-degree angle.
I love this image because it just, it's very much like, you know, when you're doing drawings on your piece of paper and you do kind of poche, and then if you were to put it up on the wall, it kind of looks like that. So it's bringing sort of exploration and ideas about architecture into a 3D reality for us.
Yeah.
So we'll stop right there. I know that we ran over probably a little longer than we wanted to, but if there are any questions, we can take that.
Oh yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you guys. Yeah, we'll open up to our panelists for questions and then we'll address the Q&A. So yeah, go ahead, you guys.
I first saw the regrade piece at Henry Art when you had the space there.
Wow, that was 2005.
Yeah, that was my senior year of my undergrad degree in fine art. I was at Walla Walla University, and I would go up to Seattle or Portland to visit museums as often as I could. But I'd never been in art before, and so I didn't realize that was actually not like that hill that you guys rebuilt inside the gallery. I didn't realize that was. Yeah, had never been in there without the hill there. So it's very interesting, the idea of like doing a temporary construction of a previous state that, you know, gave me the impression of that was the reality. So anyway, that was an interesting, you know, metaphor within a metaphor within a metaphor, which seems to be the theme. I'm very how you guys feel your work affected architects and their I mean people that are familiar with your work. How do you feel it's changing the way they consider structure?
I think it simplifies for us. You know, I think architecture is so tectonic and very complicated. There's so many parts of details and things to draw. Before we start actually doing construction and building large scale sculptures, I think we fussed around the drawings so much, the technical drawings so much. And I think, you know, those beautiful drawings which we get into about drawing caulk joints and screws and things like that. At the end, it's like, you know, kind of like you put there and you kind of smudge with your finger. So the effort and the of what you think, the expectation is so different when you're building versus drawing. So I think when we think about architectural space, it feels a little bit same way too, is that after looking at all this kind of abandoned structures and the residue, like a foundations and things like that, the things that I'm drawn to is the simple gestures that it gives me inspirations and ideas of what the possibilities could be. So I think we tend to come up with a simple design that relies on the feel of the space more than anything else. And I think for function and things, I just feel like it's much more in flux than the importance of the space. I don't know if that makes sense.
Reggie, could you ask that question again? Because I feel like a little bit of the audio cut out there and I might not have heard a word or two.
Yeah, I'm curious how your practice, your posing of these kind of implied spaces, how have you seen it, or how do you expect it will affect architects who are building functional spaces?
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for saying that over again. Well, let's see here. I don't know that I can say that there's, that we have an effect, or it's not necessarily our intention. I think, like Annie is saying, we're sort of following our perceptions and our interest and what we got really excited about in school and studying architecture, and found really fertile ground for us in looking at the things that weren't being studied and talked about. So much about architecture and the process of building and the clients who you get and the funding sources and the land you use, it's already predetermined when you begin a project. You see a call out, your firm goes after it. It's a convention center, or it's a house, there's a zoning is established. There's all this predetermined stuff that is scripting what's going to happen before you even get to it. And I think that we felt that there was so much more fun and interest to be had on basically creating your own program and being your own client and having your own dialogues and following your own research outside of the typical, architect-client relationship. And so if there's anything that can be gained from other people looking at our work, it might be that there are other ways to have a practice. There's other ways to work creatively. I think we really see ourselves as in between a fine art practice and an architecture practice. Our favorite projects are ones that are directly in between, because I think we can borrow and work in both disciplines simultaneously. And we wish that there were more opportunities for that to occur. There's not a lot of reason to build non-functional architecture, but there's such an amazing dialogue to be had about space and its impact on, sociology of humans and the culture that you're building in, and about the landscape and the people who have been here for millennia. And I think there's just a richness to be explored. And I almost wish that there were programs in architecture that were like 5 years of how to become an architect and never design a building. That would be a really great program. That'd be one I would sign up for. But I just think that that's what we're really excited about, and that's what we've been chasing for a long time. Is this notion that space is an open-ended avenue of exploration. That there shouldn't be any predetermined notions of it, and we were hoping to work outside that framework, and so we're just still trying to do that.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really excellent and very inspiring. I really liked this. I think there was an exhibition, was it in Philadelphia, with the sort of room full of like AC ducts and sort of the all the stuff that architects aren't really supposed to think about. And it's sort of like the other element that people just walk through cities sort of ignoring. And I really enjoyed how the imaging techniques that you guys have been exploring have put those to the forefront, like the sort of other element in the city, the element that doesn't show up on maps or on like schematics or diagrams. So yeah, I think that was more of just a comment of appreciation, because it really speaks to the importance of accounting for like the, everything else, the sort of like the else aspect of architecture, the remnants sort of. To the very first pictures that you guys showed, with the the landscape with the sort of ruinous concrete, yeah. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I think that realization really came directly out of that that research with the laser scanner. It was a mistake. It wasn't what we were supposed to be, what we said we were going to study. It wasn't what we thought we were going to discover. And it just is like we said, it was an accident, but it was such an important discovery for us. I can remember the first time we designed a house working for a firm, and I hadn't thought about where the electrical strike was going to hit the house. You know, I didn't even think if it was going to be underground or come in from overhead. And we designed the house, and then here comes the electrical contractor, and he's like, well, we've got to run the line there. And he's like, ran the line straight into the middle of the facade and put a pipe and a weatherhead and down to the ground. It's like, oh my God. But that kind of thing, it becomes the building over time. And you think that you've got an idea of what the building is, but come back in 40 years, and if it's not demolished, that's kind of a victory. But it's probably got already 10 layers of people adding utilitarian things over the top of it. And I think that one response is to be defensive and proactive and like, okay, it's all going to happen on the back side of the building or what have you. But those things are necessary and are become a really big part of what we see as a city. And I think that is what one aspect that we were really excited about. Like, this is a whole nother work of architecture that's happening in parallel with the city that we hadn't really even thought of before. And so that's kind of where that came from.
Yeah, thank you for the comment too. I think we're also looking at a lot of sort of accidental landscape in a way right now. Is there are things that are just left over because the city didn't have opportunity to become bigger. And so as a lucky accident, there are a lot of old growth trees that are left behind in some of the cities. The big cities, we don't have them anymore. And now when I look at those photographs, when I take those photos and come back, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we have to write those cities and make sure they preserve those environment that, it's been there for 100 years. And so there's other aspect of it. But I think it's really about paying attention. You see in the movies, in detective movies or something, they take a photograph and they see a glimpse of somebody going like, who's that? And then they start focusing on that person. It's almost like that a little bit. I think it comes as came as an accident. Now we're aware of it. So we're kind of looking for that too.
Thank you guys very much for this talk. I mean, the work is beautiful. I had a bit of a critical question, or maybe a bit of a tricky question. You talk a lot about space.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm looking at this picture, and what I see is the snow getting stuck in between, or the snow getting stuck, in what would be a wall.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what a picture of this look like, what a picture of this would look like in a really misfortunate angle, let's say underneath that archway.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other moment where you were building up the scaffolding in that desert, and then the ants started to come up to the highest point.
Mm-hmm.
Or that moment when you go into the city and you go and you look at a 60-degree cone of your vision, and you start cutting out in that moment from that image the moving people, the advertisements, the water towers, and so on, as to reveal the architecture, the capital A architecture. But I wonder, obviously, we do not experience architecture just from a single moment, but rather a continuity. We move around it, through it. And so we can understand an architecture, even if it's covered by graffiti or the surface. And so I wonder whether, I'm asking you, do you honestly believe that your work is about space, or is it maybe about something else, more of a, let's say, a postmodern approach to architectural thinking of the kind of, Venturi Scott Brown? If you look at their Victoria and Albert addition to the Victoria Albert Museum, we have multiple historical styles, kind of similar to the image that we're looking at now. So I just wonder, is this really about space, about a phenomenology of space, or is this more of a cerebral exercise? I'm not really sure if my question is coming across, but this is kind of what I'm looking at. Just like the fact that the snow goes inside of what we would perceive to be a building. This image kind of triggered that question.
Mm-hmm. That's a great Great question. Thank you for that. And it proposes a bunch of avenues of inquiry. I think that when we try to make a blanket statement about what we are doing holistically, I would say that we are engaged in the discovery of space, or an inquiry about space and our interaction with it, and then less about the object. But the object exists in a landscape that we are working and acting around, you know, by just physically moving. And so I think that what ends up happening a lot with our work is that it's not always about space, it's also about surface. And the LiDAR work brought that to the forefront for us, the laser scanning work, that the city became less about what we knew what was happening inside of the building. It was also less about the shape of the space between buildings, say what makes the public life of the city street in that space. And it became about what is that sort of like highly complex surface without materiality. That was a really big inversion for us about how we thought about solid and void, that really there's a surface there that is, that we're constantly like identifying and cataloging and ignoring. It's almost like when you walk in a city, you don't hear the 10,000 sounds that are happening. You focus on the one, the car approaching you, or the guy with a bike bell, or the hot dog guy talking to you. You're ignoring almost everything all the time. And we made that discovery that, okay, well, I'm looking at a brick wall and I already assume that a brick has a weight, that there's mortar, the brick wall has a certain thickness, there's a certain number of widths, and behind that there's going to be a generic space. But really all that we're getting in terms of visual and acoustic and touch are the surface of a city. And so that was just a new experience, and it has a spatial component because surfaces relate to one another. And I think that, like this image in the background here, this is as much about an object as it is about space. The space in this particular piece is internal to a relatively narrow piece. There's several spaces operating at once, but this solid object, or seemingly solid object, is especially seen here in the snow, operates within the void of this public space that's around this new building at a college campus. So that we're aware of that, but it's, for us, this one in particular is an exploration of translucency and spatial void and solid. So it's us sort of working with all of the things that we understand about how you make certain gestures and how they interact with one another, and being able to basically sculpt, draw, or work as an architect translucently. So this particular one, I can't say that it's necessarily specifically only about space. I think for us, a good example would be the Maryhill Double project. That for us is a pure spatial study about how your actions upon a land affect everything around it, how it's a carving away of the sky, and how a solid can be a void, and how does that container relate to its landscape that it's in. So I think that is a pure sense of that, of our larger interest. And this project, Oblique Intersection, is really more about studying translucency.
I think also this image too, it was one of the, like, my favorite projects, working with the filigree structures, because up until now we were doing filigree work as we were like a building architecture. Everything's 90 degree, you know, like it's kind of a reasonable or logical conclusion that when you start building. With this, we decided to introduce angles. And what it did was it kind of created visual chaos at a point when it's not aligned. It didn't make any sense. And that was really exciting to me. Like walking through, like, what the heck is that? Like, it looks like just a jumble of hair. And then you walk by and then something aligns and all of a sudden you see a space or opening or staircase. And I feel a little bit like that about my feelings toward architecture, is that I don't want everything to be completely revealed in a way. I want it to be ambiguity and things that I don't know that I get to discover, or I think a lot of us feel that way as we go to like abandoned buildings or something that is a residue of something that existed. you have no idea what was it before. But when you walk in there, you start imagining like, oh God, this could be a great, kitchen, or this could be a amazing exhibit spaces. I think you give it a reason, because you as a person have this spatial experience that informs how you see the space. And I think that's really interesting to me. And people often ask us that question, like, what do you want your work to be used as? How do you think architects would take your work? And I don't, while I have opinions and I can have that kind of a conversation separately about solving problems in different regions through architecture, I just want it to be something that I can suggest and they come away, or the viewers come away with something totally different. That's exciting to me, is that they make other interpretations. And I've certainly done that by looking at other people's work or something that were accidental, and it gave me different ideas, and that's really exciting.
Yeah, I don't think we touched on 10% of that question that you asked, but
hopefully.
I think that's the beginning of it. If anybody wanted to build on that or ask a different one.
How does your work overlap the field of journalism?
Whoa. All right.
Because that's what I keep getting, is that there's a sense that you guys are actually like you're exposing social condition that is typically, if there wasn't a journalist out there reporting on it, it would go unnoticed.
That's a great question.
Well, it's funny because we were reading a bunch of our own work and essays about our work, just kind of preparing for a show coming up and this conversation and other press releases. And, as doing artwork, there are artists who are doing political artwork, and I always kind of stood against that, like, oh, I don't want to do political artwork. But you are. I mean, you're doing work, and it can't not be not political with everything that you believe in and you're pouring into it. I think, again, I think I wouldn't be a journalist who are reporting so much as maybe I will be a commentator, if I can put it that way, that I would show my observations and share with you as readers. And if you were to ask me on a side conversation, what do you think the waterways how should be handled, the rivers should be taken care of, I would have a specific feelings about that. But I think I would just share generally about what I saw, without giving conclusions about that. I think that our reason for that is I find inspirations and I find my deepest engagement and solutions when people give me that opportunity, instead of giving me answers and directions of how I should solve. And, we need some of that too, but for them to come and give me information and show me all those and have me come up with a solution or answer to those, I think that gives me a responsibility back to observe and come up with my interpretations or further the solution. So I would think that. I think I had expressed about looking at trees. I think it's hard not to do that living in Northwest. And we just, through artwork, we're scanning the largest Douglas fir trees we can find. And we found one in Oregon, which was super exciting. Hiked and used a LiDAR scanner to scan that, made sculptures from it. And, just looking at those things, you can't help not to feel sad about the state of things. But we have to do things in a way that is proactive. What does that mean? Like, how can I express that through artwork and my architecture, work? What can I do to negotiate that? And so I think we're doing a lot of drawings and sculptures now called contained landscape. Our idea of controlling landscape, reintroducing landscape into architectural environment, and just kind of the subject around that. And it's really interesting to me and exciting to me to make those work. And at the end, when people look at those work and what they would come up as a kind of answer to or contrast to, that's going to be really fun for us to have a conversation too.
I think there's we didn't get to show very much work today, but there's a lot of our work which is really couched in a critique of architecture. We're very opinionated about how we build and why we build and longevity and sense of materials. And it comes out, but it's rarely ever like right on the surface of what the piece is titled or what we say about it. It's latent in the work. And I can think of a couple in particular, which were really, like intended as a primary critique of how we build. This one piece we did at the Boise Art Museum and about, it was done 10 years ago. It was about what we perceived to be the arrival of 3D printed buildings back then. And it's coming to pass as it must. But we were thinking a lot about, that and its relationship to labor and what materials are going to be used and what about the notions of disposability in architecture and the waste of resources. It's there because we think about it a lot in everything that we're doing. And I'm sure with your project on the farm, it's a big component of the program. It's something that clients are more and more asking about. It certainly was a big part of our education at the University of Oregon. It had the earliest sustainability program. So it's been in our mind for a couple of decades now. And it's a big part of one reason why we choose not to build a lot of times, why we didn't want to go into architecture. And a lot of the projects that we did do, it's amazing to me how short things last as you work. Like I can't think of very many commercial projects that last more than 20 years. And that's really something, it's a fact of life that every Starbucks that's ever built, every chain needs to be demolished every 20 years. It has a 20-year built-in lifespan. You hear that, like I'm sure you've heard it in architecture school, like buildings have a 20 to 30-year lifespan. And it is rare when something lasts longer than that. It's really the exception. And it's kind of incredible. And it's a component of a lot of our work, but it's not something that we choose to proselytize about.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you guys for the extensive.
Max, I had a very quick thought to add in terms of representation and how fascinating it is to observe your photography as well as the drawings and how the different means of representation seem to collapse. So looking at the pictures that you have now on the screen, it looks like could have been a drawing on a vellum. And then the opposite, like it could also have been one of the scans that we saw you produce with this very, very millions of points in space. So to what extent, I guess when you build something, are you drawing it? Is the act of building an act of drawing in your practice?
I do think that that's true. That so we build almost everything that we design. There's been a few projects, we did a couple of big commercial projects, which we had contractors on, but we almost always build everything that we design. And so we have a big fabrication shop and we have a staff of 5 people now, but it varies depending on what's going on. And I do think that the act of making is an act of drawing, especially if you get to make what you design. There's a fundamental difference between creating a set of drawings that somebody else is going to make and something that you're going to make, because you have shorthand information that that can be scripted with a single line that will mean 10 things that to get somebody else to build it, you have to do 10 new drawings. But the process of making it yourself means that you're making a provisional commitment to something. A line is a demarcation of something in space, and you may go to set it, but because you're making it yourself, you get to change it. And the changing is really what is the most enjoyable part of the making, because it's almost like a master builder used to be. Like when an architect would design a cathedral, it would be a provisional set of drawings. You would have an elevation and a plan, and maybe a few sketches about the window, but everything else would be made up along the way. And that is no longer a part of making architecture, except the design build process, which is really not a major component of building. The ability to draw something and go and make it yourself, or be part of the building and make changes as you go, is a tremendous creative advantage, I think, for the building process. And I think that's sort of that might be what attracts us to work that is more drawing based. Like this filigree to us is a literal drawing in space, because we can take something like a wire, it's curved, we have it straightened, we cut it to length, and then we place it just like a line. And so we get to literally draw in space with this particular type of work, but also with things that are solid, it's the same for us. And so I do think it's the same, and I do think it collapses. I think the photography is different though. It's very definitely, over time, I can look back and see those images. It's very 2D. I struggle with the fact that it's not 3D data when I look at photography. And I look at a lot of our older work and I wonder what it would be like if we had had some of the tools that we have now to be able to capture something in 3 dimensions. And so I'm interested about that. Like what is the 2D plane when you capture something in space? And I think that goes back to Alexander's question, looking at this piece. Ultimately, I can't really share. I can show you a video of walking around it, but the real test of your experience of it and your belief in it and your interest would be you traveling here and then walking around it, which is admittedly the ultimate commitment. We have had people who like, oh, I just want to see your piece. Where is it? And then they'll go there and make the pilgrimage. But really, this is for the people in Lubbock who come to school here, who go to this campus, and they happen to come across it. And they will make that discovery on their own. And those are the ones that we value the most. Like, what does it add to the experience of people who live around these pieces?
And I think,
yeah,
I was just going to say, I think, now we're stuck on this piece image, so we keep talking about this, but
we should change it.
Yeah, we, this piece also, it does so much of making space on itself. I think, of course, building does that. It sits in the sunshine. Building is so solid, so its shadow is solid. Whereas because this is porous, its shadow is really porous. So it gives another dimensionality. And this was a really good solution in this area too, because it's really, really hot. And something as light as this provides incredible amount of shelter in a sunlight. And so where people occupy during summer months in this sculpture and where they navigate is dictated by this sculpture and the climate there. So that's sort of an interesting thing about experiencing sculpture in a spatial way that way. It's not completely contained internally only, but it's what it does with the natural environment that creates a spatial experience too.
It's interesting to think about the temperature of the piece and the temperature around it and the temperature that it absorbs and how we occupy it as a result. Just very quickly, and I know we've exhausted your time, and thank you for that. I just wanted to very quickly come back to the point that you made, Dan, about photography and the 2-dimensionality of it as compared to the scanning technology that you showed us earlier. There is a question in the Q&A asking about how does it work, the scanning device that you used. What is it actually capturing and how is it different than photography? And I think you touched a little bit upon that, but maybe you can answer more directly.
Okay, great. I'll just make it really quick because I know that some of you are more familiar with it than others, but it's if you've seen those laser distance measuring tapes before at the hardware store where it basically, you push a button, it sends a laser pulse. When that laser pulse hits a surface, there's a reflected energy that comes back towards you, the sender. There's a sensor that can tell how long it takes for the infrared frequency to come back. And that that is such a highly accurate measurement that it can tell you the distance down to a couple millimeters in accuracy over, 600 feet or 900 feet away. It's really amazing what this tool can do. At the survey level, when the machine was first built, it's basically sending out pulses of laser about 1 million times a second. And that's hitting typically in a row, a vertical line. And it gives you just basically tell it, I want, 100,000 vertical points. And then it's going to do that at however many degrees. You can go 180, 360, all the way around. It's going all the way up and over you to the backside. So you're getting millions and millions of points of measurements, and it's really only capturing whatever that laser hit and it comes back. If it doesn't hit anything, nothing comes back and there's a void. So if it lands on something and there's enough of a surface there to reflect back, it'll tell you how far it is away from you. And so you're getting kind of a pixelated image of millions of dots that are just spatial data that you can then take into a computer. Those are called point clouds. And they're really cumbersome to work with because their files are so large and they're so difficult for computers to handle. And there's not great software to work with it and edit it, especially with the large volume of data you can get back, like in a city. It's a monstrous amount of data. But it's getting better over the last decade. There's slightly better software. But anyway, once you have it, that's just one image. And then you go set the tripod up down the street, you take another scan, and then you can register those two scans together. So if you had missing information, say behind a car, you could go behind the car and shoot the backside, put the two together, and now you've got a more complete model. And then you can start to do that as many times as you want and have. So in our case, we scanned Times Square. It took us a week. We probably did 10, 12 scans a day, and we stitched it all together. So we have a very complete model of Times Square in 2011. That's sort of like captured in time, but it's like building blocks to us because it has all of the people in it, all of the cars, the signs, the street lights, everything that laser hit is now in that model. And it's like captured in amber and becomes just data that you can use and model with. And you can compare it to any other data because it's to scale. Like we could capture a Coke can on the 40th floor of a building and know that Coke can is, 6 centimeters tall or whatever. And that's going to be the same as one 5 blocks down the road. So what's amazing about it is how accurate it is and your ability to compare that material with any other data to scale. So it's a remarkable tool, and it's not flat. That's the beauty of it, is that you're not, someone can take that model and do with it what they want in any viewpoint.
I wanted to say something, I think something that we didn't really talk about in depth was, I think your studio project kind of involves around the nature, the environment, and what is how does building respond to those, ecological considerations. And I think about in terms of course, everybody kind of design buildings with the locations of windows and skylights and directions of where the building faces and all those kind of, there's a basic rules of how you design. I think more than ever, it's really important for us to pay attention about those things. They're free. Daylight is free. You just have to bring it inside of a building. And it is, you are being educated to be an expert on how to utilize that the best way you can with aesthetics. I think that is a simple known thing that we've been using, but we should not forget the rain, the wind, in the extreme heat, humidity. I just feel like all the inventions that are coming out is just about material. Like, what is the newest material that is, interesting and awesome? But I think we really need to think about in response to what are things that are omnipresent. It's there all around us all the time, and it may be awful because we think of it as awful. But what if we were to turn that around as our advantage? What if you utilize that humidity as something that you are going to address and actually come up with a solution? I think it would would change. I think it would. Architecture has power to change people. I think it has a power to change the world. So, yeah, I think it's exciting. I think it's a scary moment in our lifetime that we're seeing this change is happening so quickly, and there are a lot of suffering and death. But I feel like it would give us a mission, a purpose that we hadn't utilized before.
Nice.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie and Dan. Thank you very, very, very much. A lot to think about, and we're certainly looking forward to your show at T-Space. We have put in the chat the links for friends and audience to RSVP to join us there. And you're more than welcome to join us on Monday when our residents present their works. We've put in the chat again the links for everyone to RSVP. And thank you very much. Max, any closing remarks on your end?
Yeah, definitely. I just want to thank again our donors to T-Space and the Summer Residency Program. Richard Armstrong, Steve Pullman, Silman, Elise Yaffe, Jeffrey Brown, the Pratt Family Fund, Al Health Foundation, and the Art of Building. This kind of doesn't happen without the supporters, so we just want to make sure we thank them, and especially being the conclusion of the lecture series this year. This was really wonderful, and thank you so much, Annie and Dan. This was really, really enlightening.
And it's been indeed an incredible journey with 8 very distinct presentations and discussions. It's been a real pleasure.
Fantastic.
Thank you guys.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.